On clinic days, the people come on foot, over distances as great as 50 miles. They come from every corner of the bush country to our mission station at Zorzor. They come as Kezli came, because they're sick and frightened, believing that the spirit of death has passed into them. It's the sign of the cross that brings them. Oh, they don't understand it at first. To them, it's simply a powerful sign, the symbol of a special medicine that belongs to the white man, and strong enough to frighten away the evil spirit that has attacked them. And that's what Kezli and his father thought too. You learn a lot about these people when you live with them, as we do at the mission station. You find out about their capacity to suffer. As a doctor, I've learned to respect them for their dignity and courage. And as a missionary, I've come to love them as human beings. Maybe the story of Kezli will help you understand why we missionaries feel as we do. Mission doctors haven't time for formal introductions. I met Kezli through a specimen of his blood. I guess both his father, a Loma tribesman, and the boy could tell I didn't like what I saw. When I finished my rounds that day, I made an appointment with Kezli, scheduled a more searching and intimate session. Surgery, 8:30 a.m. Next morning, Kezli arrived promptly at our little surgical shack. Oh, it wasn't the kind of operating room they told us about back in med school. Probably would frighten an American patient to death. Kezli wasn't frightened. Not much. When my wife told them through her mask to take the boy inside, I'm sure Kezli's father envisioned nothing less than a human sacrifice. Perhaps the old tribesman would have been encouraged if he knew we'd done hundreds of operations in that shack. But probably he'd have felt just as bad. Parents are the same everywhere. The human heart reaches deeper than racial difference. And so this father, too, underwent the torture of waiting, as have so many of all races, before him and since. Surgery at Zorzor is done by reflected sunlight. A mirror at the window catches a ray, reflects it in another mirror inside, and it gives us a pinpoint to work by. No electricity. The sun's the only source of power we have. The sun and, well, we say a prayer always before we begin. One thing we ask of the Lord is for him to permit us to complete our work before the sun goes down, to hold back the clouds that we may see, to give us his light, that there may be life. It was clouding up, but we were finished. Guess I'd forgotten about his father being outside. When I saw his concern, I told him as fast as I could that Kezli was going to be all right. Several weeks later, I started off for a particular village to visit an art patient. I said goodbye to my wife, my thatched roof, mud-walled homestead, and took the trail to the river. Other things they never mentioned in med school were monkey bridges, delicate tapestries of vines that sway over crocodile-infested rivers. The distant, foreboding sound of drums, heard always and everywhere in Africa. The legions of meat-eating driver ants, the scourge of the continent, will put herds of elephants and whole villages to rout. The miles of lonely, tenacious distance that an African doctor walks to make a call. Nope, they never mentioned the way an African village looks, glimmering under the bright sun. Strange, exotic, lovely. For me, the people and their ways are as fascinating now as they were when I first saw them. Theirs is an innate rhythm, revealed in everything they do. Yes, and theirs is a natural grace exhibited in their most common acts, even in the spreading of the rice to dry. Musical expression is a spontaneous product of primitive life. You can't be in an African village more than a few moments before you hear it. These women were trained to perform as children, trained by Zos, or priestesses of a secret society under the supervision of the fearful bush devil. The grim seriousness of their performance revealed their fear of their gods, their imprisonment to tradition. Well, they played and danced like puppets, and the invisible strings were held by the great bush devil, whose name was never mentioned, whose terrifying presence was always felt. Rituals made one sense the difference between their society and our own. One had only to look a little further to be reassured. I've seen kids do this on the streets of Philadelphia. And this game I always call bush backgammon. The same principle, same fun for the youngsters who play it. I found the patient in another quarter of the village. Amoebic dysentery, advanced stage. Too sick to be moved the long distance to our mission station. No facilities there, even if we could move him. My appearance in the village usually drew an audience. Youngsters especially were fascinated by the stethoscope. Seems to me I remembered that boy. Of course, surgical case. Kezli. That was it, Kezli. When my work was done, I asked Kezli to take me to his father, and we set off through the village. We found him seated in front of his hut with his wife. That is, one of his wives, pounding rice nearby. He greeted me very graciously, with the politeness customary among his people. I told him his son was of an age to be in school. It was time he learned to read and write. Would he send him to the primary grades at Zorzor? He asked the boy if he wished to go. Kezli said yes, and it was done. Kezli's first day of school was a most memorable one for him, full of surprises. The morning prayer was completely baffling. What was this? What possessed them? Were they bowing their heads because they were afraid? But then what did they fear? The bush devil, perhaps. No, they weren't afraid. You could tell there was no fear in them. But why did they behave so? Now the teacher made strange signs on a smooth black stone, and it was like a signal to the others. Here was another mystery, equally bewildering. He'd have no part of it. Indeed, Kezli grew bored that first day. He suddenly had an idea, thought better of it, and resigned himself to his fate. As time went on, Kezli's education continued. Each morning, carrying his books on his head, he walked many miles through the bush to Zorzor. At first, it was the promptings of his father that kept him coming that great distance. The old tribesman felt that by going to school, Kezli was repaying the debt for the operation we performed. But once Kezli's interest developed, nothing could have kept him away. One morning, Ruth and I were walking toward the clinic when we heard someone call, "Doctor!" We shook hands, African style. Ruth gave him a charming greeting, joked with him. But this morning, Kezli was dead serious. You see, he'd learned to read. Oh, he knew only one page, probably had it memorized. But for him, it was a revelation, a turning point in his life. Of course, we told him how very proud we were. And with great pleasure and great dignity, he placed his crown on his head and went off. A king. We knew this boy had what it takes. Kezli would go far.
When he had gone as far as he could at Zorzor, Kezli came to our mission at Muhlenberg to continue his education. He had never seen such great buildings before, nor such splendidly dressed boys and girls. It seemed to Kezli that they were talking about him, a country boy from the bush. Surely he didn't belong in school with them. Yes, it seemed that everyone was staring at him. He felt terribly self-conscious. At first glance, Muhlenberg was as bewildering to Kezli as Zorzor had been, a lofty citadel beyond his reach. But as the years passed, I watched Kezli take his place in the rhythm of life at Muhlenberg. Often with the other students, he would relax after school, playing and singing the old tribal songs they'd known since childhood. I was Kezli's teacher. I remember calling him to discuss an essay he had written. He had grown to be a fine young man, very much a leader among his fellows. His essay was particularly good. It revealed an orderly mind and an idealistic spirit, two definite characteristics of the boy himself. The students at Muhlenberg represented the outstanding youth of the country, and scholastic competition was keen. But Kezli was at the head of the class. He had an innate love of learning, an inquiring mind, and a very favorable way of expressing himself. I recall one Sunday after church when something happened that made a great difference in Kezli's life. It had been a fine service, and the loveliness of the day we found when we left church was one designed to heighten our love for God and His world. Kezli was talking to a friend when I noticed that he noticed Yandir, a girl of the Peli tribe. Yes, and Kezli's friend noticed that he had lost his audience. I'm afraid Kezli was hopelessly smitten. He was quite unconscious. Not so Yandir. Being a woman, she was very conscious of exactly what had happened. And, being a woman, so was I. Thereafter, Kezli and Yandir often walked together on the campus. At first, Yandir carried her own books. But a combination of chivalry, courage, and time transferred the burden at Muhlenberg as it does on campuses everywhere. Kezli had arrived at the point where the carrying of Yandir's books was his exclusive privilege. But he hadn't quite reached the point where he was ready to consider the Christian home. So he quickly buried the idea, or perhaps I should say, filed it away for future reference. It was clear that Kezli was approaching a time of decision. As he grew closer to that time, he visited one of the missionary pastors at Muhlenberg and counseled with him. Two thoughts were paramount in Kezli's orderly mind. First, he was considering the Christian ministry, and second, he knew that a Christian family life was essential to sustain him. In this home, he saw the future he wanted for himself. He read the symbols that spoke of companionship, of a home church given up out of self-sacrifice, of spiritual strength. As their evening together drew to a close, the pastor read to him from the scriptures, read Christ's great commandment to his disciples. And as Kezli listened, he thought he heard a voice calling to him from across time and space, and bearing a message meant for all mankind, which somehow, at this moment, seemed meant specifically for him.
On the afternoon following his visit to my house, Kezli and Yandir took a walk together. They visited the old church built by the pioneer missionaries who came here long before us, opening up the wilderness, planting the seed of faith in what was then hostile soil. Today, this church is unsafe for use. It's a monument, like the monuments in the cemetery behind it. A quiet testimony to the heroic men and women who labored here, that God might live in this land after they themselves had perished for his sake. In the worn faces of these stones, Kezli and Yandir read the tragic stories of Christians who had given their lives for them. Tragic stories which are becoming triumphant as they, the living, justify the faith of the dead. Later, they walked down to the river, to a cool place from which they could see the school. The same sight Kezli had seen when he came here from Zorzor 4 years ago. It was here that Kezli spoke to her of his love, of his hope that they might share the future together. They would be graduating soon. If she consented, they could be married at Muhlenberg. As they sat by the swiftly flowing river, they could somehow see reflected in it the substance of their dream. It was a vision that could one day come to life. Then Kezli told her that before she gave her answer, she must know he had decided to dedicate his life to Christ as a minister to his own people. And dreaming again, they saw a picture of what they might face together if, as man and wife, they went back into the bush carrying the word to others, even as it had been carried to them. They visualized the experience that might be theirs if together they became fishers of men. Kezli could hear himself preaching in the Loma tongue, telling the people what Christ had meant to him, how he had opened his life and set him free, and how Christ would do the same for each of them. Yondia could see herself leading a hymn, bringing to her people a form of expression based not on fear and cruel tradition, but on a spirit of quietude, peace, and serenity, on a spirit of fellowship before God. Then suddenly, that fear as old as time itself, so deeply rooted, forced its way up from the depths of their consciousness and burst frighteningly across their vision. It was the bush devil, the spirit of darkness, force, vengeance, the angry instrument of the unknown. He had learned of the Christian intrusion in his village, and now he danced in the great square as a warning to those who forgot his authority. To touch him was death. To defy him was worse. Then, in their dream, they saw hope rising above the fear and turmoil, sitting at their feet, awaiting their word. Yes, they saw hope, and in its presence, fear departed, and they knew that all the force of evil was powerless before simple, childlike faith. They sensed the duty that was theirs, to free their people from the past, to lead them into the future, and the discord in their hearts grew silent as they read from God's word. This was the substance of their thoughts by the river. The decisions to be made, marriage and the Christian ministry, would channel the current of their lives forever. Yondia was in doubt. The issues were too great to be decided then. She would need time to think. Several days later, there was an outdoor service held on the great bluff which commands a beautiful view of the river at Muhlenberg. It's perhaps the loveliest place in the country, and Christians have worshipped there for almost a century. The sound of their singing rose into the air and carried out across the land through the country of the Pele and beyond, carried down the swift-flowing river to the sea. As they sang, Kezli suddenly sensed that this was the moment of decision. He knew what the answer must be for himself. But what of Yondia? The future together. The answer was yes. The answer was yes. They would take their places in the Christian ranks with other national workers in bringing the light of the gospel to Liberia. They would stand shoulder to shoulder with those of their own people who had made a similar decision, dedicating themselves to Christian service that future generations might find a more abundant life. The answer was yes. They would become a part of the team of consecrated Christian men and women who had come to this land to share Christ with their people. Black man and white, together they would build a new world, carve out a new beginning in the timeless bush. White man and black, together they would build Christ's kingdom in the wilderness. Already at Zorzor, a new clinic was rising to replace the crude shack to which Kezli had come so many years before. New light would filter through into darkness, touching other Kezlis, building other men to full stature. Christianity in this land enters also into the halls of a receptive and helpful government. It is a faith that is building attitudes through which men of all races can meet on common ground, building mutual respect and understanding, clearing the air of suspicion, the mind of fear and prejudice. These are the hands of builders who build on freedom's foundation. In Africa today, the seed of hope is being planted in the name of Christ, who brought hope to the world. The harvest is plenteous, but the laborers are few. These men and women are pioneers of a new frontier, opening the horizons of the mind so that men's spirits may be reached. Working through the consecration of the living by the inspiration of the dead. Working in Christ's name and for his sake. The harvest truly is plenteous. The laborers are few, but among them will be counted Yondia, a Peli girl, and Kezli of Zorzor.